In the early hours of 19th September 1980, deep beneath the plains of rural Arkansas, a sequence of small technical errors escalated into the most lethal nuclear weapons accident in United States history, exposing the hidden fragility of Cold War deterrence at a moment when the superpower rivalry had entered a renewed phase of tension and uncertainty. The site was a Titan II intercontinental ballistic missile complex near the town of Damascus, part of a nationwide network of silo-based weapons designed in the early Cold War to deliver thermonuclear warheads across continents with minimal warning. And although by 1980 the Titan II system was already aging, it remained on constant alert, armed with a single warhead whose explosive yield dwarfed that of any weapon ever used in combat. The logic that kept the missile operational was rooted in continuity rather than confidence, as the Titan II had been integrated so deeply into U.S. strategic planning that removing it from service required political will, funding, and time that were perpetually deferred in favor of maintaining readiness. On the evening of 18th September, a routine maintenance task began the chain of events that would transform this silo into a catastrophe, as a two-man maintenance crew was dispatched to perform standard fuel system checks inside the launch complex, a confined and highly controlled environment where even minor deviations from procedure carried significant risk. During the operation, a heavy socket used to tighten a pressure cap was accidentally dropped, falling through the silo and striking the thin metal skin of the missile, puncturing a fuel tank containing highly volatile propellant. The design of the Titan II relied on hypergolic fuels that ignited spontaneously upon contact, a choice made decades earlier to ensure rapid launch capability, but one that also meant leaks could produce toxic, explosive atmospheres with little margin for error. The puncture allowed fuel to begin leaking into the silo, releasing vapors that spread invisibly through the confined space, immediately creating a life-threatening situation for personnel and a potentially catastrophic hazard for the missile itself. Emergency procedures were initiated, and the maintenance crew evacuated. But the gravity of the situation was not immediately apparent to all levels of command, reflecting a broader pattern in Cold War nuclear operations in which confidence in technical systems often obscured their underlying vulnerabilities. As hours passed, teams of Air Force personnel rotated through the site attempting to assess and contain the leak, all while operating under the pressure of maintaining security over a live nuclear weapon whose status was increasingly uncertain. The silo's design, optimized for protection against external attack, complicated internal response, as limited access points and rigid safety protocols slowed efforts to stabilize the situation and increased reliance on judgment under uncertainty. By the early morning hours, conditions inside the silo had deteriorated sharply as fuel vapors accumulated and pressure levels fluctuated, creating an environment where even minor disturbances could trigger ignition. At approximately 3 a.m. on 19th September, the accumulated stresses reached a breaking point, and the missile exploded with enormous force, blowing the 740-ton silo door hundreds of feet into the air and destroying much of the complex in a matter of seconds. The explosion did not produce a nuclear detonation, but the conventional blast was powerful enough to kill one Air Force technician, injure many others, and eject the nuclear warhead from the silo, throwing it clear of the explosion and landing it nearby without detonating. The fact that the warhead did not explode was not the result of design perfection, but of contingency, as multiple safety systems functioned under conditions they had never been tested to endure, underscoring how the avoidance of catastrophe depended on mechanisms operating at the edge of their intended parameters. The immediate aftermath of the explosion unfolded in chaos and confusion, as emergency responders confronted a destroyed launch complex, injured personnel, and the terrifying uncertainty of the warhead's status, all while operating under strict secrecy and the knowledge that any misstep could escalate an already disastrous situation. Local authorities and civilians were kept largely in the dark, even as evacuations were ordered and roads sealed, reflecting the Cold War imperative to manage public perception and prevent panic in the face of nuclear risk. Within the military chain of command, the Damascus explosion triggered urgent reassessment of the Titan II system, forcing officials to confront the reality that a weapon designed to deter nuclear war had nearly caused mass casualties through accident alone. The incident exposed how aging infrastructure, human error, and rigid adherence to readiness doctrine could converge to produce outcomes no adversary action had achieved, revealing a dimension of nuclear danger largely absent from public discourse. As investigations began, it became clear that the explosion was not the result of a single mistake, but of systemic factors embedded in the design and operation of Cold War nuclear forces, including reliance on highly volatile fuels, silo configurations that prioritized launch survivability over maintenance safety, and organizational cultures that normalized risk in pursuit of deterrence. The Damascus accident occurred at a time when U.S.-Soviet relations were again deteriorating, with arms control under strain and nuclear arsenals still vast, lending the incident broader strategic significance as a reminder that the greatest threats to nuclear stability did not always originate from adversary intent. Internally, the Air Force moved quickly to secure remaining Titan II sites and reassure political leadership that the nuclear deterrent remained intact. Yet the shock of the explosion reverberated through strategic institutions, challenging assumptions about control, safety, and the acceptable costs of readiness. The public narrative that followed emphasized the success of safety systems in preventing nuclear detonation, but this framing obscured the deeper lesson of the Damascus explosion, that nuclear deterrence relied on complex systems whose failure modes were unpredictable and whose margins for error were dangerously thin. The Titan II missile complex near Damascus thus became a symbol of Cold War vulnerability, illustrating how the infrastructure built to ensure national survival could itself generate existential risk through routine operations. As subsequent reviews and congressional scrutiny unfolded, the explosion accelerated long-delayed decisions to retire the Titan II system, not because it was strategically obsolete, but because it had become indefensible as a safe component of the nuclear arsenal. In this sense, the Damascus accident marked a turning point in U.S. nuclear history, revealing that the logic of deterrence could no longer justify the continued operation of systems whose risks were no longer theoretical, but demonstrably lethal. The events of September 1980 exposed a fundamental contradiction at the heart of the Cold War nuclear order, that weapons built to prevent catastrophe could produce catastrophe without any hostile action, and that the stability of deterrence depended as much on the management of internal failure as on the balance of power between adversaries. The explosion in rural Arkansas did not alter the global strategic balance overnight, but it shattered illusions of infallibility within the nuclear enterprise, forcing a reckoning with the reality that human error, aging technology, and institutional inertia could bring nuclear systems to the brink independently of war. In doing so, the Damascus Titan missile explosion stands as one of the most sobering episodes of the late Cold War, a reminder that the danger of nuclear weapons was not confined to moments of crisis or confrontation, but was embedded in the everyday maintenance of deterrence itself. In the immediate wake of the explosion, the Damascus site became the center of an unprecedented emergency response that exposed the limits of Cold War nuclear crisis management, when catastrophe originated not from enemy action, but from internal system failure, forcing military authorities to operate under conditions for which doctrine offered little guidance. Emergency teams arriving at the destroyed complex confronted a scene of devastation, with the silo obliterated, debris scattered across the surrounding fields, and the nuclear warhead lying intact but displaced from its controlled environment. A circumstance that demanded extreme caution as specialists worked to verify that the weapon remained safe and that no radiological release had occurred. The uncertainty surrounding the warhead's condition dominated decision-making in the hours after the blast, as commanders balanced the need for rapid stabilization against the risk that movement or mishandling could trigger secondary hazards, highlighting how nuclear accident response relied heavily on expert judgment rather than predetermined procedure. Communication with civilian authorities was tightly controlled, as evacuations were ordered in the surrounding area without detailed explanation, reinforcing a familiar Cold War pattern in which secrecy was prioritized to prevent panic, even as it limited public understanding of the true danger. Within the Air Force, the explosion prompted an immediate grounding of similar maintenance operations across other Titan II sites, as commanders sought to prevent replication of the sequence of errors that had led to disaster, revealing the extent to which safety practices depended on procedural discipline rather than inherent system resilience. Investigative teams were convened to reconstruct the chain of events, examining maintenance protocols, equipment design, and organizational decision-making to determine how a routine task had escalated into a lethal accident, and their findings quickly pointed toward systemic vulnerabilities rather than isolated negligence. The dropped socket, initially framed as a simple human error, was understood within a broader context of design choices that placed maintenance crews in close proximity to volatile fuels within confined spaces, a risk accepted for decades because it had not yet produced catastrophe. This retrospective clarity underscored a recurring feature of Cold War nuclear operations, in which latent hazards were tolerated until an accident forced recognition of their consequences. The investigation also scrutinized command decisions made during the hours-long response to the fuel leak, revealing uncertainty about authority, responsibility, and the interpretation of safety. Data, factors that contributed to delays and misjudgments as conditions inside the silo worsened. These findings challenged assumptions that nuclear forces were managed through clear hierarchies and fail-safe procedures, exposing instead a complex organizational environment where information gaps and institutional confidence could impede timely action. Politically, the Damascus explosion drew attention at the highest levels of government, as the loss of life and near loss of a nuclear weapon demanded explanation, even as officials sought to reassure the public and Congress that the nuclear deterrent remained secure. Briefings emphasized the absence of nuclear detonation and the success of safety systems, framing the incident as evidence of robustness rather than vulnerability, a narrative that mirrored responses to earlier accidents while downplaying the scale of risk involved. Yet internally, the tone was markedly different as senior officials confronted the reality that the Titan II system, long criticized for its hazardous fuels and aging infrastructure, could no longer be defended as an acceptable component of the arsenal. The Damascus accident thus accelerated discussions that had stalled for years, transforming abstract concerns about safety into concrete imperatives for change. Within Strategic Air Command, the explosion reinforced awareness that deterrence credibility could be undermined not only by enemy capability, but by domestic failure, a realization that reshaped how risk was evaluated in operational planning. The event also influenced broader debates about nuclear stewardship, highlighting the tension between maintaining constant readiness and ensuring the safety of personnel and civilians, a tension that had been obscured by decades of routine operation without major incident. For the community of Damascus and the surrounding region, the explosion left a lasting imprint as residents grappled with the knowledge that a nuclear weapon had been violently expelled into their environment, an experience that challenged abstract notions of deterrence by making nuclear risk immediate and personal. This local dimension contrasted sharply with national discourse, which remained focused on strategic implications rather than human cost, reflecting a persistent disconnect between policy-level considerations and lived experience. Analytically, the Damascus accident demonstrated how complex technological systems could fail catastrophically through the interaction of minor errors, design vulnerabilities, and organizational inertia, offering a case study in what later analysts would describe as normal accidents, where failure is not exceptional but inherent to tightly coupled systems. The explosion revealed that nuclear deterrence, often portrayed as a rational balance of terror, was sustained through infrastructures whose everyday operation carried unpredictable risks, risks that could manifest suddenly and violently without adversary involvement. As investigations progressed and cleanup operations concluded, the Damascus site was sealed and eventually dismantled, leaving behind a scar in the landscape that symbolized the hidden costs of Cold War readiness. The incident entered institutional memory as a warning, shaping training, safety protocols, and attitudes toward aging systems, even as it remained largely absent from popular narratives of the Cold War. In this phase, the Damascus Titan missile explosion forced a confrontation with the reality that nuclear danger was not solely a product of geopolitical rivalry, but was embedded within the maintenance and management of deterrence itself, setting the stage for decisions that would ultimately remove the Titan II from service and alter the composition of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. As the investigation into the Damascus explosion deepened, its findings exposed a convergence of technical design flaws, procedural limitations, and cultural assumptions that had accumulated over decades of Cold War nuclear operations, revealing how the Titan II system embodied an earlier era's priorities in ways that had become increasingly incompatible with the realities of late Cold War risk management. The missile's reliance on liquid propellants, chosen in the 1950s for their performance and rapid launch capability, had always imposed extraordinary hazards, as the fuels were highly toxic, corrosive, and hypergolic, creating conditions in which even minor leaks could escalate rapidly into life-threatening emergencies. Yet these dangers had been normalized through years of incident-free operation, reinforcing a belief that discipline and procedure could compensate for inherent instability. The Damascus accident shattered this belief by demonstrating that no amount of training could fully eliminate the risk posed by a system whose safe operation depended on perfect execution under stressful and confined conditions. Investigative reports highlighted how maintenance crews were routinely required to perform complex tasks inside silos never designed with human safety as a primary consideration, a legacy of design choices that prioritized survivability against attack over ease of access or error tolerance. These reports also revealed ambiguities in command authority during emergencies, as decision-makers struggled to interpret sensor data and to determine when conditions warranted escalation or evacuation, illustrating how organizational structures optimized for launch readiness could impede crisis response when the threat originated from within. The Air Force's internal response to these findings was marked by urgency and defensiveness, as leaders sought to balance acknowledgement of failure with reassurance that the broader deterrent remained credible. a balancing act that mirrored Cold War patterns of damage control following nuclear accidents. At the same time, the Damascus explosion provided undeniable evidence that long-standing concerns about the Titan II were no longer theoretical, strengthening arguments within the defense establishment and Congress that the system should be retired without further delay. These arguments gained traction not only because of the risk to civilians and personnel, but because the explosion undermined confidence in the reliability and controllability of a weapon that was central to deterrence doctrine. The prospect that a missile could be destroyed or compromised by routine maintenance raised questions about survivability under attack and about the wisdom of retaining a system whose operational hazards rivaled its strategic value. In this sense, Damascus accelerated a transition already underway as newer solid-fueled missiles offered improved safety, reliability, and ease of maintenance, reducing the tolerance for legacy systems that imposed disproportionate risk. The accident thus became a catalyst for institutional change, not by introducing new concepts, but by forcing recognition that existing assumptions were untenable in light of demonstrated failure. Beyond technical and organizational lessons, the Damascus explosion also influenced how nuclear risk was understood conceptually, reinforcing the view that deterrent systems were tightly coupled and prone to cascading failure, a view that challenged earlier confidence in layered safeguards and redundancy. Analysts examining the incident noted how the dropped socket, fuel leak, delayed response, and eventual explosion formed a chain in which each link appeared manageable in isolation, but proved catastrophic in combination, underscoring the difficulty of predicting failure in complex systems. This perspective resonated with emerging critiques of high-risk technologies, contributing to a broader reassessment of how nuclear weapons were managed and how much risk could be justified in pursuit of strategic stability. Politically, the explosion occurred at a moment when public trust in institutions was already strained, amplifying its symbolic significance even as details remained controlled. And the loss of life associated with a nuclear weapon accident challenged narratives that portrayed deterrence as a remote or abstract concept. Within the Air Force, the human cost of the incident reinforced the moral dimension of nuclear stewardship, highlighting the burden placed on individuals tasked with maintaining systems whose failure could be catastrophic, and prompting renewed emphasis on safety culture and accountability. These internal shifts, however, unfolded within a broader strategic environment that continued to prioritize deterrence above all else, ensuring that reform would be incremental rather than transformative. As plans to deactivate Titan II sites advanced, the Damascus complex became a reference point in training and doctrine, cited as evidence of the consequences of complacency and the limits of procedural control. The site's destruction and subsequent dismantlement marked the physical end of one node in the nuclear network, but its lessons persisted, shaping attitudes toward risk and reinforcing skepticism toward claims of infallibility in nuclear systems. In the larger Cold War narrative, the Damascus Titan missile explosion occupies a distinctive place as an accident that forced action rather than accommodation, translating long-recognized danger into irreversible policy change. It demonstrated that while deterrence could absorb near misses and accidents for years, there existed thresholds beyond which continued operation became politically and strategically indefensible. By exposing how close a routine maintenance task came to producing far greater catastrophe, the explosion underscored the reality that nuclear danger was embedded not only in geopolitical confrontation, but in the everyday practices that sustained readiness, a reality that could no longer be ignored once its human and material costs were made undeniable. As the Cold War entered its final decade, The memory of Damascus lingered as a reminder that the most lethal risks of the nuclear age were not always those envisioned in war plans, but those generated quietly by aging systems, institutional inertia, and the assumption that past success guaranteed future safety. As the implications of the Damascus explosion reverberated through the U.S. defense establishment, the incident became a focal point for a broader reassessment of how Cold War nuclear forces were governed, revealing that the risks exposed in rural Arkansas were not isolated defects, but symptoms of a strategic architecture built for an earlier era and maintained through inertia. Congressional oversight intensified as lawmakers sought explanations for how a single-drop tool could escalate into the destruction of a nuclear missile complex. And although much of the technical detail remained classified, the basic contours of the accident forced acknowledgement that the Titan II system posed unacceptable dangers that could no longer be justified by its strategic role. Hearings and internal reviews converged on a shared conclusion that the combination of volatile liquid fuels, aging infrastructure, and maintenance practices that placed personnel inside confined silos constituted a level of hazard incompatible with contemporary standards of safety and accountability. This conclusion did not emerge easily, as the Titan II had long been defended as a reliable component of deterrence whose risks were managed through discipline and procedure. Yet Damascus demonstrated that procedural rigor could not compensate indefinitely for fundamental design vulnerabilities. The decision to retire the Titan II fleet, announced in the aftermath of the accident, thus represented not merely a technical upgrade, but a symbolic admission that certain Cold War assumptions had reached their limits, marking a rare instance in which an accident forced the abandonment of a major weapons system rather than incremental modification. The deactivation process unfolded over the early 1980s as silos were dismantled and missiles removed, a quiet dismantling that contrasted sharply with the dramatic destruction of the Damascus site and underscored the tension between public reassurance and internal reckoning. Within Strategic Air Command, the retirement of the Titan II was framed as a transition towards safer and more survivable systems rather than as a repudiation of deterrence itself, reinforcing continuity even as practice changed. This framing reflected the enduring priority placed on credibility and stability, ensuring that lessons from Damascus were absorbed without undermining confidence in the broader nuclear posture. Nevertheless, the accident left a lasting imprint on organizational culture, heightening sensitivity to maintenance safety, human factors, and the potential for cascading failure in tightly coupled systems. Training programs and safety reviews increasingly emphasized hazard recognition and risk mitigation, incorporating scenarios drawn from Damascus to illustrate how small deviations could produce catastrophic outcomes. These changes represented an evolution in nuclear stewardship, acknowledging that preventing accidental disaster required not only technical safeguards, but a cultural willingness to question assumptions and to recognize when systems had outlived their tolerable risk envelope. The Damascus explosion also influenced scholarly and analytical discourse, as it provided concrete evidence supporting critiques of high-reliability claims associated with nuclear deterrence, reinforcing arguments that complex technologies could not be rendered perfectly safe through redundancy alone. Analysts highlighted how the accident exemplified the interaction of human error, design compromise, and organizational inertia, challenging narratives that attributed nuclear risk primarily to adversary behavior rather than internal dynamics. This shift in perspective broadened understanding of Cold War danger, reframing it as a product of systems and practices as much as of ideology and rivalry. For the community of Damascus, the long-term impact of the explosion extended beyond the immediate loss and disruption, as the site became a symbol of the hidden burdens borne by civilian populations living near strategic infrastructure. A reminder that nuclear deterrence imposed costs unevenly and often without consent. This local dimension rarely penetrated national strategic debate, yet it underscored the human stakes of decisions made at distant command centers. In historical retrospect, the Damascus Titan missile explosion occupies a critical position as a late Cold War event that forced tangible change, revealing that while deterrence doctrine remained resilient, its implementation was subject to limits imposed by safety, politics, and public tolerance for risk. The accident demonstrated that the management of nuclear forces was an evolving process shaped by feedback from failure as well as success, and that stability depended on the willingness to adapt before catastrophe occurred. As the Cold War moved toward its conclusion, the lessons of Damascus remained embedded within professional memory, reinforcing skepticism toward claims of infallibility and highlighting the importance of continual reassessment in systems where the margin for error was vanishingly small. The explosion thus stands as a reminder that the nuclear age was sustained through constant negotiation with danger, and that the endurance of deterrence owed as much to the recognition of vulnerability as to the projection of strength. A recognition brought into stark relief by a single-drop tool that revealed the lethal fragility beneath decades of routine readiness. As the Damascus Titan missile explosion came to be fully contextualized within the closing chapter of the Cold War, its ultimate importance lay in how it exposed the limits of institutional tolerance for risk in a system long sustained by postponement and denial, revealing that even the most entrenched elements of deterrence could be dismantled once their dangers became undeniable. The retirement of the Titan II fleet marked more than a technical transition, signaling a broader recognition that nuclear stability required not only credible retaliation, but credible safety, and that weapon systems whose everyday operation endangered lives and territory undermined the very security they were meant to guarantee. This recognition emerged not from abstract strategic theory, but from the material reality of catastrophe narrowly avoided, reinforcing a recurring pattern in nuclear history in which learning followed failure rather than foresight. The Damascus explosion demonstrated that deterrence systems were not insulated from the passage of time, but instead accumulated risk as components aged, procedures calcified, and assumptions went unchallenged, creating conditions in which a single lapse could cascade into disaster. In this sense, the accident underscored that nuclear danger was dynamic rather than static, shaped by organizational behavior and maintenance practices as much as by geopolitical rivalry. Within the U.S. military, Damascus became a reference point for the necessity of confronting legacy risks proactively, influencing attitudes toward modernization and decommissioning across the nuclear enterprise, even as strategic competition with the Soviet Union continued to demand readiness. This influence was subtle but persistent, reinforcing a culture that increasingly recognized the need to balance deterrence credibility with the prevention of self-inflicted catastrophe. Politically, the incident illustrated the constraints under which nuclear policy operated, as officials sought to manage public reassurance while implementing substantial internal change, reflecting the enduring tension between transparency and perceived stability. In the nuclear age, the fact that the deadliest nuclear accident in American history remained relatively obscure to the public highlighted how Cold War governance relied on containment of information as a means of managing risk perception, even as it addressed risk materially through system retirement. Analytically, Damascus challenges narratives that portray the Cold War as a period governed primarily by rational actors and stable balances, revealing instead a landscape in which complex technologies and human systems generated hazards independent of intent, hazards that required continual adjustment to contain. The explosion underscores that the absence of nuclear war was not proof of safety, but the outcome of constant intervention, learning, and adaptation in the face of recurring failure. In historical perspective, Damascus stands as a late Cold War warning that the gravest threats to security could arise from within, through the interaction of aging technology and institutional inertia rather than from deliberate aggression. It reveals that the management of nuclear weapons was as much an exercise in organizational resilience as in strategic planning, and that the endurance of deterrence depended on the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths about vulnerability. By forcing the retirement of a major weapon system, the accident demonstrated that catastrophic risk, once made visible, could override the inertia that sustained dangerous practices for decades. The Damascus Titan missile explosion thus occupies a singular place in Cold War history as an event where accident produced irreversible change, exposing the hidden costs of readiness and the limits of tolerable risk. It serves as a reminder that the nuclear age was defined not only by confrontation and deterrence, but by the continual struggle to prevent systems built for destruction from destroying their own foundations. A struggle that shaped policy quietly but decisively in the final years of the Cold War. As the Damascus explosion's lessons filtered outward beyond the immediate military and political response, they contributed to a broader late Cold War reckoning with the sustainability of nuclear deterrence practices inherited from earlier decades, underscoring that the credibility of deterrence depended increasingly on the credibility of safety, reliability, and governance, rather than on raw destructive power alone. By the early 1980s, the United States was managing an arsenal that reflected layers of historical compromise, in which older systems like the Titan II coexisted uneasily with newer technologies. And Damascus exposed how this layering created uneven risk profiles that could no longer be ignored without courting disaster. The accident highlighted that nuclear forces were not monolithic, but assemblages of systems with distinct vulnerabilities, and that strategic planning, which treated them as interchangeable instruments of deterrence, obscured critical differences in safety and controllability. This insight influenced how risk was discussed internally, encouraging a more discriminating approach to force structure that considered not only deterrent value, but operational hazard and long-term sustainability. Within this evolving framework, the Damascus explosion became a cautionary example cited in debates over modernization, illustrating that deferring difficult decisions about aging systems merely postponed, rather than eliminated, the moment when their risks would surface. The incident reinforced the understanding that nuclear stewardship required continual reassessment of legacy infrastructure, a process complicated by budgetary pressures, political inertia, and the symbolic weight attached to long-standing weapons programs. Yet the decisive retirement of the Titan II demonstrated that change was possible when accident stripped away abstraction and revealed concrete consequences, altering the balance between strategic justification and acceptable risk. The explosion also influenced how nuclear accidents were conceptualized within Cold War historiography, shifting emphasis from isolated mishaps towards systemic vulnerability, and reinforcing the argument that deterrence functioned within a tightly coupled technological environment where failure could propagate rapidly and unpredictably. This perspective challenged earlier narratives that framed nuclear safety primarily as a matter of individual error or exceptional circumstance, instead highlighting how organizational design and cultural assumptions shaped outcomes. The Damascus case illustrated that the normalization of deviance, whereby hazardous conditions became accepted through familiarity, played a critical role in sustaining risky practices until catastrophe intervened. In this sense, the explosion exposed the social dynamics underpinning nuclear operations, revealing that the perception of control was often constructed through routine rather than guaranteed by design. The human dimension of the accident remained central to its legacy, as the death of an Air Force technician and the injuries sustained by others underscored that nuclear deterrence imposed real costs on those tasked with its maintenance, costs that were often invisible in strategic discourse. This reality complicated the moral landscape of deterrence, introducing questions of responsibility and sacrifice that extended beyond abstract calculations of national survival. While these questions rarely translated into public debate during the Cold War, they informed internal discussions about training, staffing, and the ethical obligations of nuclear stewardship. The Damascus explosion also intersected with growing international concern about nuclear accidents, contributing indirectly to broader conversations about transparency, confidence building, and the management of nuclear risk across alliance systems, even as superpower rivalry limited the scope of cooperation. Analytically, the incident reinforced the view that nuclear stability was contingent not only on adversary restraint, but on the internal capacity of states to manage complex, high-risk technologies over long periods without succumbing to complacency or decay. This capacity was shown to be finite, requiring renewal through modernization, institutional learning, and the willingness to retire systems whose risks had become disproportionate. In the final decade of the Cold War, such lessons gained urgency as arsenals aged, and the cumulative probability of accident increased, making Damascus a harbinger of challenges that extended beyond a single system or site. The explosion thus serves as a lens through which to view the late Cold War transition from expansion to consolidation, from improvisation to risk management, revealing how the nuclear order adapted in response to failure, even as its fundamental logic endured. In this broader context, Damascus illustrates that the Cold War's relative absence of nuclear war did not reflect the elimination of danger, but the continual, imperfect management of it, a process punctuated by accidents that forced recognition of vulnerability and compelled change. The Titan II explosion stands as a testament to the reality that deterrence was sustained not by invulnerability, but by the capacity to learn from near disaster and to act before catastrophe became unavoidable, a capacity that proved decisive in shaping the final configuration of the Cold War nuclear arsenal. In its final historical balance, the Damascus Titan missile explosion of 1980 stands as one of the most consequential internal shocks to the Cold War nuclear system, not because it altered superpower relations directly, but because it forced an unambiguous confrontation with the limits of tolerable risk inside a deterrence architecture, long sustained by inertia and confidence in routine. The destruction of the silo and the loss of life demonstrated that nuclear danger was not confined to hypothetical scenarios of war, but was embedded in everyday maintenance practices, carried out far from geopolitical flashpoints, revealing how the infrastructure of deterrence could generate catastrophe without any adversary action. The accident exposed the fragility of systems designed decades earlier under different technological and strategic assumptions, systems whose continued operation depended on the belief that past success justified ongoing exposure to hazard, a belief that Damascus rendered untenable. By compelling the retirement of the Titan II fleet, the explosion marked a rare moment when accident translated directly into irreversible structural change. signaling that the credibility of deterrence could no longer be separated from the credibility of safety and stewardship. This outcome underscored a central paradox of the Cold War nuclear order, that weapons intended to guarantee national survival could undermine it through their mere operation, and that stability depended on constant vigilance against internal failure as much as against external threat. The legacy of Damascus lies in its demonstration that deterrence was not a static condition achieved once and maintained automatically, but a fragile process requiring continual reassessment of technology, organization, and human practice. It revealed that nuclear peace was preserved not through perfect control, but through repeated encounters with vulnerability that forced adaptation before catastrophe occurred. Historically, the explosion challenges narratives that portray the Cold War as governed primarily by rational calculation at the highest levels, instead highlighting the role of maintenance crews, aging hardware, and organizational culture in shaping the true margins of safety. It shows that the nuclear age was lived not only in command centers and diplomatic summits, but in confined silos where small errors could escalate into events of national consequence. As the Cold War moved toward its end, the lessons of Damascus remained embedded within professional consciousness, reinforcing skepticism toward claims of infallibility and emphasizing the necessity of retiring systems whose risks exceeded their strategic value. In this sense, the Damascus Titan missile explosion stands as a definitive reminder that the survival of the Cold War era depended as much on confronting internal danger as on deterring external enemies, and that the absence of nuclear war was the product of continual correction rather than inherent safety, a reality laid bare when a single dropped tool revealed the lethal fragility beneath decades of routine readiness.